Part 2, An Alphonsian Approach to Spiritual Direction. Part 2 of this lecture series flows out of the general overview of spiritual direction in the preceding presentations and develops a model of direction based on St. Alphonsus's manner of making mental prayer. It offers a brief overview of Alphonsian spirituality, discusses how Alphonsus should be interpreted today, presents the dynamics of the Alphonsian model of direction, looks at the various qualities of an Alphonsian director, and describes what a typical session of Alphonsian direction might look like. The goal here is to provide directors with a simple, easy to learn, and practical tool that they can use in helping those seeking guidance to become themselves in the faith. And those interested in expanding their reading on this subject can turn to my book, With Open Heart, Spiritual Direction in the Alphonsian Tradition. Lecture 6, The Spiritual Legacy of St. Alphonsus de Liguori. I'd like to begin with a quotation from St. Alphonsus's The Practice of the Love of Jesus Christ. O robber of hearts, the strength of your love has broken the exceeding hardness of our hearts. You have inflamed the whole world with your love. O most loving Lord, inebriate our hearts with this wine, consume them with this fire, pierce them with this dart of your love. After our general overview of some of the fundamentals of spiritual direction, we now need to take a look at and ask ourselves if spiritual direction in the tradition of St. Alphonsus de Liguori, founder of the Redemptorists, doctor of prayer, and patron saint of confessors and moral theologians, has anything to offer today's spiritual directors as they seek deeper insights into the nature of their ministry. Can his teachings offer directors anything that will enable them to practice their craft with more competence and heightened pastoral concern? Can they provide directors with insights into how they can help others to listen and respond to the gentle movements of the Spirit deep within their hearts? Answering such questions is more difficult than many of us might first be willing to admit. The spiritual landscape of 18th century Naples and its environs was very different from our own. Some of the most basic presuppositions of Alphonsus's approach to spiritual direction, for example, its highly directive nature, its close link with sacramental reconciliation, are questioned by many involved in the ministry today, if not outrightly opposed. Today's spiritual directors are likely to be men and women from all walks of life, a stark contrast to the predominantly clerical influence upon the ministry prominent in St. Alphonsus's day. In many circles, moreover, the phrase spiritual direction has itself given way to more non-directive expressions such as spiritual friendship, spiritual guidance, spiritual accompaniment. Such changes give witness to the radical shift in the approach taken towards spiritual direction in the last 50 years. Today, the ministry is much more interdisciplinary and ecumenical than it was in the 18th century. So much so that one may wonder if Alphonsus has anything at all to offer spiritual directors whose approach to their ministry is so very different from his own. When dealing with the life and the works of St. Alphonsus de Liguori, we cannot expect to find precise, ready-made solutions for how the practice of spiritual direction should be conducted today. It would be equally unrealistic, however, to think that it has nothing at all to offer the current understanding of the ministry. Although Alphonsus was limited by the general spiritual outlook of his day, he was also at times both probing and creative enough to surpass it, and often with great benefit to the people he served. In understanding Alphonsus's relevance for direction today, much will depend on how we approach his thought with respect to it and how we choose to emphasize various aspects of it. In this lecture, we will examine the basis of his reputation as a spiritual master and identify those elements that can be helpful to those interested in using the Alphonsian perspective as a touchstone for their practice of direction today. Now, at the very outset, it is important for us to recognize Alphonsus's deep missionary fervor. The major projects of his life, his mission preaching, his writing, the work of the founding of the Redemptorist congregation, his life of prayer, were all motivated by his profound desire to share the good news of plentiful redemption in Christ with others, especially the poor and most abandoned. Alphonsian spirituality is first and foremost a gospel spirituality, one rooted in the person of Jesus Christ, and which takes seriously the Lord's injunction to his apostles to make disciples of all nations. Now, in the context of 18th century Naples, Alphonsus interpreted this calling and personalized it in a very specific way. Rather than looking to the foreign missions, he looked to those areas in his own backyard where people did not have easy access to the ordinary means provided by the church for spiritual growth. This option for the poor and willingness to go where others refused to travel led Alphonsus and his small band of followers to the hilltops and small mountain villages on the back roads of the Kingdom of Naples. Their evangelizing efforts for the poor, illiterate, peasant stock they found in the forgotten hamlets of Campania, Puglia, Basilicata, and Calabria helped change the spiritual landscape of southern Italy. These early Redemptorist missionaries reminded those they served that God had not forgotten them, but was very much with them in their desire and thirst for spiritual growth. To ensure that such growth would continue, Alphonsus and his followers used flexible structures of devotional practice, such as confraternities, Eucharistic devotions, pious spiritual exercises that would help to foster a life of prayer and devotion in these fledgling faith communities once they had left. Alphonsus's particular brand of gospel spirituality helps us to appreciate even more the various nuances in the old debate as to whether or not there is a single Christian spirituality or many. To the extent that every expression of it must be rooted in the person of Jesus Christ, there is only one. But to the extent that it must be rooted in the historical circumstances in which we find ourselves, it must be many. So, to sum up Alphonsus's approach, we must remember that he was first and foremost a man of prayer. He believed that everyone should share a deep, intimate relationship with Jesus, and that the key to understanding and to developing such a relationship was to be persistent and dedicated in the life of prayer. He who prays is certainly saved, he would say, and he who prays not is certainly condemned. These words of Alphonsus indicate the strong emphasis that he placed on the role of prayer in fostering a mature relationship with God. Prayer for him was the great means of salvation. Everyone received sufficient grace to pray. Everyone was called to meditate, to enter into mental prayer. And without mental prayer, he said, it would be very difficult. It would be very difficult to find one's way to God. Mental prayer, he said, was morally necessary for salvation, meaning that without it, it would be very, very difficult to find one's way. He simplified the prayer form for the people he served in order that they might understand it and use it, many of whom were illiterate. And in doing so, he was heavily criticized by a number of diocesan and religious clerics for casting pearls to swine and thereby desecrating the church's treasures by sharing them with people who could not possibly appreciate them, let alone put them into practice. But Alphonsus had little time for such judgmental remarks or for those who made them. Alphonsus had little time for this, for throughout his life he pursued a consistent policy of popularization of the church's teaching on prayer in a simple, easily understandable style. He met people where they are. He helped them little by little to pray to God as intimate friends speak to one another. Prayer for Alphonsus was the means par excellence for fostering friendship with God and developing an intimate communion of hearts. Listen to what he says. He says, "There may be some who, after a perusal of my spiritual works, will accuse me of tediousness in so often recommending the importance and necessity of continual recourse to God in prayer. But I seem to myself to have said not too much, but far too little." And again he says, "I say and repeat and will keep on repeating as long as I live that our whole salvation depends on prayer, and therefore that all writers in their books, all preachers in their sermons, all confessors in their instructions to their penitents should not inculcate anything more strongly than continual prayer." For Alphonsus, leading others to God was what it was all about. Generally speaking, everything he did can be viewed as a type of spiritual direction. His preaching, his teaching, his celebrating the sacraments, his visiting the sick, any activity whose ultimate goal was to help people draw closer to Christ could be thought of as spiritual direction. But in a more particular sense, he understood that spiritual direction, when understood as this helping relationship focused on a person's growth in the spiritual life, we see it as a very, very specialized ministry. And Alphonsus emphasized that especially in his confessional practice, where he believed that it was important not merely to counsel a person so that they would be forgiven of their sins, but also give them appropriate counsel so that they could deepen their relationship with Christ and grow in the spirit of holiness. He believed that spiritual direction was for the masses. He believed that everyone should have access to spiritual direction. In a way, we can say that he demystified the role of the director in the Christian tradition. He created what we can say is a meat and potatoes approach to spiritual direction. As far as his confessional practice is concerned, we can say that, in the words of Emilio Laje, he believed that the confessor should have an attitude of being more of a father and doctor than a judge, an attitude of kindness in giving penance, a marked preference for the poorest and most ignorant social class, a concern for giving the penitent not only the means of perseverance for preventing a relapse into sin, but also the means of advancing in the way of holiness. And finally, recognizing the relationship between preaching and confession. He sought to preach the good news of plentiful redemption to as many people as possible, educating the faithful in the ways of holiness. Now, when Alphonsus, he obviously did not only see spiritual direction as taking place within the confessional, it is clear that at times he understood that spiritual direction, especially in his letter writings, could take place outside of the confessional. And this was his approach then, basically 4 steps. In the first step, the person was to be made aware of the awesome, unsurpassable love of God for him. The second step was for him to look at all the negative things which are holding him back or her back from deepening their relationship with God, and all the things that would help to improve the negative and the positive steps. The third step would be to be set on fire with ardent desires, a real yearning for the efficacious union of wills, to become not merely conformed to God's will, but union with God. And then fourthly, there must be a continually refocusing of the heart on the final goal of union with God in heaven. The final goal of spiritual direction for Alphonsus was to draw a person closer to Christ. To conclude, Alphonsus de Liguori was revered in his day as an outstanding moralist and spiritual writer. Typical of its day, his approach to spiritual direction was directive and closely tied to the formation of conscience and the Church's confessional practice. At the same time, it was imbued with a love for freedom under the law and a concern for balance and prudential judgment and an emphasis on fatherly kindness. He was deeply aware of humanity's sinful condition. At the same time, he continued Christ's missionary efforts through his preaching, the promotion of the Church's sacramental life, especially confession, and his numerous writings. Even his prayer life was oriented towards the conversion of souls. After all, how could he expect others to walk the way of holiness if he himself did not take his own spiritual life seriously and forge a path ahead for them? Although a connection between spiritual direction and sacramental confession still exists today, in recent decades it has become more and more common to separate the two. This is due, in large part, to the growing number of the laity who have become spiritual directors and, not being priests, cannot administer the sacrament. If such be the case, we maintain that spiritual direction in the Alphonsian tradition should, at the very least, maintain a healthy respect for the sacrament and be able to help those they accompany to discern when they need to take advantage of the sacrament. And we also maintain that Alphonsus' spiritual legacy has much to offer today's spiritual directors, especially if, as we shall see in the next lecture, they focused on his approach to mental prayer. To conclude with some reflection questions. How would you describe Alphonsian spirituality? What role does the heart play in Alphonsian spirituality? What role does prayer play in Alphonsian spirituality? What did Alphonsus understand by mental prayer? How did Alphonsus understand the relationship between moral and spiritual life?